Something I've noticed over the years meeting with business leaders is that they all share one major issue with their team and in their business, and that is accountability. In short, getting done what they think has to be done and what is clear in their own head. And often they tackle this issue with systems and processes. Now, systems and processes are absolutely fantastic for consistency, but increasingly in our businesses, consistency isn't necessarily what we're looking to create. If you're making a car, then absolutely consistency is key. But in most instances, small businesses are dealing with a customer face to face much more so than a car manufacturer is. And actually, consistency can really harm those businesses. What these businesses need is a higher standard, a standard of excellence. And in order to set a standard, you have to do this clearly. And I have for you a 10-step process for creating a better standard in your business. With standards, you can make clear to your team what excellence looks like and hold them to that standard. Without that clarity, lack of clarity is the enemy of accountability. So without that clarity, it is very difficult to maintain a standard. Step one. Simply, your standard should have a name. It sounds simple, it is simple, but if your standard doesn't have a name, then who knows what we're talking about when we're discussing this within our business. And also, because you're going to have multiple standards, you want each standard name to be different and unique. That's the easy part. Step two, this is still pretty easy. I would say that step two is the scope. What does this standard apply to? What tasks and activities does it cover? This stuff you should be able to work out pretty quickly. It's already in your head and it'll be in the head of your team members that are carrying out the work that this standard will apply to. Number three, it's a little bit fuzzy, but what is the purpose of this standard? What is the objective here? Why is it important? This is really relevant for people to maintain a high standard in their work. They have to understand that there is a reason for it. And it's not just to not get fired, but it's quite likely to keep the customer happy. It might be to not lose the company money. It might be safety. But understanding the reason, understanding the purpose and objective of a standard will help people run with the standard and own it. Step four, you've got to have a performance baseline for your standard. What are the KPIs and targets for this standard? What are the performance drivers? To give you some examples here, let's say that the objective here is to reduce your weight. Then weight is the measurement. Weight is a KPI, but a target for that KPI is the actual number. Let's say it's 80 kilos. It doesn't really matter. But the KPI and the target, these are two different things. But the performance driver is something else entirely. We might want to measure the weight. We might do that by stepping on the scales, and we'll come to that later. But what's going to drive the performance? Quite likely in this example, it's either going to be eating less or exercising more. This is what's going to drive performance. So we not only want the measurements that are the KPIs and the targets for those that tell us that we can track the performance of this standard and make sure that we are keeping on track and we are maintaining excellence. We want to know exactly what it is that drives performance. And we want to be able to hopefully have measures for that as well, or at least make it as clear as possible. And that's going to have to come from your team. Step five are the actions and behaviors. What specific actions are required to fulfill this standard? Are there behavioral expectations? Are there other outcomes and impacts that are maybe not so quantifiable in your performance, in your KPIs and targets? It could be that they have to be very professional. It could be that you need to present well. There could be a whole bunch of behaviors that are sometimes quite hard to pin down, but we know in our business when somebody isn't doing it quite right. And the issue is because we haven't made that clear up front, it's very hard to single somebody out and say you're not doing this in the right way. They might be meeting their KPIs, but of course, if you haven't made clear that there are particular actions and behaviors that they should be aligned with, and you haven't made that clear up front in your standard, then you're not going to be meeting the standard, even if KPIs are being met. Number six, you've got to have an implementation plan for your standard. First of all, where will this KPI data come from? You may not immediately have that available. You may have to create new systems in order to measure this. Also, what resources or tools are needed to achieve the standard? Is there any training or support provided? This is important. You don't want your standard to fall over at the first hurdle because it's very difficult to implement. And of course, this standard should stay in a way that means that people in future can take on this standard. Maybe if somebody is away, if somebody changes job, if more people need to complete this particular type of work, you want somebody to be able to pick this up and run with it. So we want to know how this is implemented as a standard. Step 7 is measurement. How and or by who will this standard be tracked This is important. Will the person carrying out the work be tracking this? Will a manager be tracking this? Will this be tracked automatically in some centralized CRM or ERP system that you have? Be clear about how measurement will happen so that you know from the start that measurement is being tracked. This is performance management. You have to have the standard, and then you have to be able to track and measure performance against that standard. Step 8 is accountability. Who is the one person that is responsible for ensuring compliance with this standard, and what are the consequences of failing to meet this standard? And I don't just mean that somebody's going to lose their job, I'm talking about the natural consequences. If this standard isn't maintained, what happens? It's important to know that, for example, if a standard isn't maintained, it could harm other people in the organization that are feeding off whatever this standard produces. It could, of course, be customers. It could, of course, be company finances. And then there are second order effects to all of those. So we want to be clear about who's accountable and what happens if that accountability fails. Number 9 is usage. Who's going to use this KPI? Who's going to analyze its performance, and at what frequency? There is nothing worse than creating a standard and getting this far and then it collects dust. We have to keep it alive. Who is going to do that? At what frequency are we going to look at the information and potentially review whether the standard needs to be changed, perhaps improve, for example? And finally, step 10. Can you find examples and visual evidence of this standard? Imagine at McDonald's, somewhere there's a picture of what a burger should look like. What's the equivalent for that in your work? We need to be able to demonstrate and show and evidence what best in class looks like. If that means customer communication, you should have emails that have been written that have been well received, maybe phone calls that have been well received. If it's projects that you do, there should be a best in class example of what a perfect project, perfectly executed, looks like. Create evidence for your standards. Finally, you put all of this together, you document this, and this can be done on one page, perhaps with the evidence on supplementary pages, but you can put all of this on one page and put it on the wall. Put it around the people that are going to be held to this standard, and make sure that you maintain the accountability that is so sorely lacking in so many businesses.